our camp there this morning, and I hope you guys are all planning to come to VBS tonight. It is at least my fourth year here, and it seems to only get better and stronger. And so I appreciate you guys being here, letting us continue to come, and letting us be a part of this community for a week and be a part of this VBS. It is at least one, if not the premier week of our year. And so we're thankful for you guys hosting us throughout this week. Let me ask you a question. You ever find it difficult to forgive yourself? You ever find it hard even when God has already done those things, even when He has already said, ask in this way, ask in this fashion, ask after these things, I'll forgive you. Do you ever find it hard to forgive that guy that you shave every day? It's not a problem of 2023. It's a human problem that's been going on for years and years and years. Psalm 51 doesn't start in Psalm 51. Psalm 51 really starts in 1 Samuel, and its culmination ends in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12. 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12, we run into a man who is the king of Israel, whose name is David, and he runs into a lady while he's on the roof of his house one evening named Bathsheba. And from that chance meeting that he has that she knows nothing about, he's got some problems. He sees her, and he, as 2 Samuel chapter 11 will tell us, that he lingers at that stair for a while. He sees her, and then he stares at her, and then he decides that, well, I'm the king. I can have anything I want, and so I want her. And unfortunately, David's right. He is the king, and he can kind of get whatever he wants, and so he has her. The problem lies when she becomes pregnant, and this is not going to look good for him. And so, in an effort to avert the situation from what has happened, he decides to bring her husband home, first get him drunk, then kill him, thinking all that's going to be okay. In Psalm 51, we read a man who has already been forgiven by God, but David's having a problem with David. And so when we read Psalm 51, this is what we read. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness, according to the multitudes of thy tender mercies, blot out my transgression. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity. Cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgression. My sin is ever before me. Against thee, thee only have I sinned, and done this evil in thy sight, that thou mightest be justified when thou speakest, and be clear when thou judgest. Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, thou desirest truth in the inward parts. In the hidden parts thou shalt make me to know wisdom. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Make me to hear the joy and the gladness, that the bones which thou hast broken may rejoice. Hide thy face from my sin, and blot out all of mine iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from thy presence, and take not thy Holy Spirit from me. Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation. Uphold me with thy free spirit. Then will I teach transgressors thy ways, and sinners shall be converted unto thee. Deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God, thou God of my salvation, and my tongue shall sing aloud thy righteousness. O Lord, open thou my lips, and my mouth shall show forth thy praise. For thou desirest not sacrifice, else I would give it. Thou delightest not in burnt offerings, the sacrifice of God, or a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, thou wilt not despise. Do good in thy good pleasure unto Zion. Build thou the walls of Jerusalem. Then shalt thou be pleased with the sacrifice of righteousness, with burnt offerings, the whole burnt offerings. Then shall they offer bullocks upon thine altar. Been years, perhaps a decade, since 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12 had transpired. And I wonder how many days of those 10 years, how many times during the days of those 10 years did David look back on that situation and say, man, that was dumb. What was I thinking? What was wrong with me? What did I give up? What should I have done? But we can't really relate to that, can we? We don't ever look back on our lives and think, man, that was not a very wise move. When you read through the Psalms, God, through his pen of the Holy Spirit, is unraveling the emotional side of man. We can see in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, we can see the process by which God forgave David. We can see the process by which David hears that truth, how he's convicted of that truth, and now it changes. And at that point where he's convicted of that truth and he changes, God forgives him. We can see that just as plain as day. But it's in Psalm 51 where we see David struggling with David. Where we see David looking back at his life and thinking, well, I should have done something differently. You ever been in that boat? Been in that boat now? Sometimes we look at ourselves and we say, man, I should have. When we open up David's wound, as it's seen in Psalm 51, what we see is a man who is still hurting by it. Look at verse number 1. Have mercy upon me. Didn't he already have mercy upon David? Didn't he already forgive him of his sins? Yes, but what David wants him to do realistically is take away even the remembrance of that. And unfortunately, the fact is he can't. Think back, if you can, to your most embarrassing moment of your life. You got it? You got it? You ready? Now try to forget that. Think back in your life to the most traumatic portion of your life. Try to forget those things. What David is praying to God here is, help me forget. Help me forget what I did. Help me forget how foolish and selfish I was. Help me forget me. Have mercy upon me. Notice verse 1. According to thy loving kindness, according to thy tender mercies. He says this phrase, blot out my transgression. Now there are 3 words he mentions here in 1 and 2, and once again in 3. That he's going to mention as sinful activity. He's going to use transgression, he's going to use iniquity, he's going to use sin. And all 3 of those words roughly mean the same thing, but they have different flavors about them. Look at transgression for a moment. So transgression is a word that means to go past the line. So we are eagerly anticipating college football to come back on the television. And there'll be a point in the college football season where somebody kicks off and someone receives that kick and they're going to go down the sideline, and as they do, they're going to step on that line. And when they do, that official is going to go, you probably didn't mean that. You probably didn't mean to step right there. We'll just let it go on, right? That how they do it here? Oh, they blow that whistle, right? And it's that play is dead right where that happened, isn't it? Why? Because he crossed that line. Most literally in the Hebrew, he transgressed that line. So David, as he speaks of his sin, speaks about going over the line. When he speaks about the word transgression in iniquity in verse number 2, that word means to clench your fist in anger at God, as if to say, I don't care what you say, I'm not going to do it. To speak to God with a clenched mouth. Have you ever been mad at your children, so mad you go, I need you to get out of here right now. I'll talk to you in a minute, where you're just being angry. This is the same message in which God or David is saying, this is how I spoke to God. I don't care what you say, I'm going to do whatever I want to do. Iniquity. Then he mentions this word sin, which we have studied time and time and time again. The idea there, missing the mark. The idea of not only just missing the bullseye of a target, but missing the entire target. David would describe himself as one who has crossed a line with God. One who has shaken his fist at God in anger, or one who has missed the entire target of what life is. He's describing himself as being this person, and yet he says 3 times in verses 1, 2, and 3, when he speaks of transgression and iniquity and sin, he speaks of how God's going to get rid of those things. In verse 1, when he speaks of transgression, he speaks about blotting out the transgression. There are some of us who are more experienced in life than others, and you know exactly what I'm meaning when I say the phrase whiteout. You know what that is? You know, you made a mistake typing, you would take that whiteout, you'd white over it, and you would type the right word. Now we just backspace and forget about it. We don't worry about those things anymore. When you use that whiteout on that paper, you're blotting out a mistake. Covering that over so that it doesn't appear to be a mistake. God here is whiting out, is blotting over that transgression. Notice the next one in verse number 2. He says, wash me thoroughly. Wash me thoroughly. So a week ago, in a couple of days, we came back from camp. If you've ever been to camp, you know what camp clothes and camp bedding and camp towels smell like. They're awful. Sometimes you wash them once and they're not as great as you want them to be. And so you put them in there a second time. Maybe you add some borax and some extra detergent, something to kind of break it all down, and you wash them thoroughly. We don't want a smell to come out of the washer. We don't want a stain to come out of that washer. We want them to be completely washed and completely ready to go again, so that when we put those sheets on that bed again, we don't have to worry about if they're dirty or not. David speaking to God says, I want you to completely wash me. And then he says about that sin, cleanse me. Then you have a whole different idea. And we look at it in our English and we say, wash and cleanse is about the same thing, isn't it? It is until you get to the socks from camp and they're all white and they're all gross. So you put the proper chemicals in the washing machine, and then you take this additional bottle and kind of go like that. You know what that one is? Bleach. That's exactly right. Put that bleach in there. Now you have a difference between simply washing those things and then cleansing those things. Take it away from me. Blot it out. Wash me. Cleanse me. Everything that you have to do, because verse number 5 would say, I acknowledge that everything that I have ever done in a sinful state is only against you. Now, brethren, when we begin to look at ourselves and see ourselves in the way God would see us as standing before Him in a sinful state, then we realize that everything we've ever done, while it may be me against Eric or me against Andy. It is always me against God. As a matter of fact, from Adam and Eve forward, everything that has been done may be a sin against another man, may be a sin against an individual, but it's always been a sin against God and His righteousness, His goodness. And David stands before God looking back at his life, exposed and saying, I just can't forgive myself. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to treat this? I don't think I can get over it. And so as we continue down Psalm 51, here's what we read. Look at verse 6. You desire truth. You desire truth in the inward parts. You know, we can, as we say back home, we can play a good game for 4 hours a week. You know, 168 hours within an entire week. And if we meet on a regular basis when the church meets here, perhaps we meet 4 hours a week. We can keep it together for 4 hours. That's not what David's talking about. David said, I want to be one who bears light for the truth from the inside out. Not just 4 hours, but 164 hours added onto those 4 hours so that people can look at me, can distinguish what I'm doing, and can follow me as I follow you. Matter of fact, Paul would say that, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1, be imitators of me, even as I am of Christ. He'd say about himself, I want to have that truth from the inward part, not just so that people can look at me and say, he's probably okay. I want to have it from the inside out. You desire truth in the inward parts, and ladies and gentlemen, understand this principle of God that has been going on since God said, let there be light. You and I are not going to be saved by the plan of God through a faithful life unless we have that truth on the inside. Unless we are radiating that truth outward. It's not enough to have it on the outside. You got to have it on the inside. So David's desire is to have that truth on the inside. Notice what he says here, purge me with hyssop. You have an interesting phrase here in, what's that, verse 7? That's verse something. Yeah. You have an interesting phrase there in verse 7, purge me with hyssop. It's a throwback for the society of the Israelites back to Moses, who would purge those things in the wilderness with the blood of a heifer and sprinkle it with those bushes or those clumps of bushes of hyssop. And how God would cleanse everything. I don't know how you sprinkle blood, throw blood on stuff and it makes it clean. But God knows how that happens. He said, I want you to make me clean like you made those people clean. I want you to forget my sin the way you forgot their sins. And he has. But David hasn't yet. David's struggling with this. His issue is this fact. At night when he lays down and he pillows his head, I wonder if those scenes were played. I wonder if when he closes his eyes, the last thing he sees is Uriah the Hittite walking away from him with that letter. How do you get over that? And it moves on in verse 7. It says, purge me with hyssop that I'll be clean. Wash me, I'll be whiter than snow. Look at verse 8. Make me to hear the joy and the gladness that the bones which thou hast broken may rejoice. David is in a state where he is hurting so much so that the emotional side of it is making his bones hurt. You've cried so much where you just don't have anything else to cry? You ever felt so bad that you just didn't want to get out of bed? Ever hurt because of what you know you've done? Welcome to David. Make my bones stop hurting. Make the physical pain that my body's feeling because of the emotional strain on me, make it go away. And God would say, I've already done those things. Notice verse number 9. David would say, one of my favorite phrases in this chapter, hide your face from my sin. Dear God, hide your face from my sin, but don't hide it from me. God, if you turn your back on me, I've got nothing. I'm lost. I'm out in this world all alone, and I can't do it. Turn away from my sin, but don't turn away from me. Look at verse number 10. The two words here in verse 10, as he's speaking of this sin and how God would change those things, he says, create in me a clean heart and renew a right spirit within me. Those two words, create and renew, are interesting words as they're written here. Create first is from the Hebrew word bara, which means the same word God would use when he said, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1. Was there earth before God created it? Check it out. This is a trick question. Did the earth exist before God created it? Think you will. No. You know what he's saying to it? Just as you created something from nothing, create in me apparently a clean heart, because I don't have it. The one I have is one that is laden with sin, one that is pushing me toward doing those things that are wrong. So create inside me something that's new, something that's clean, something that's pure, because I don't have that. And then renew a right spirit within me. It's a cognate of the word bara, which means, once again, create something new. But he said, and then take the spirit that I would have, that I say, well, you know what I'd really like to do? And replace that with what I'd really like to do is follow God. Take the spirit of me that has the desire and has the lust and has the temptation to this world and throw it out the window and replace it with something that's good and pure. Notice as David continues through Psalm 51, he says this, restore unto me the joy of my salvation. It's interesting that the denominational world will say that David at this point was still saved, yet he just didn't have the joy of it. What in the world does that mean? You know what the biggest joy of being saved is? Knowing it. That I am square with the house, that God is satisfied with me. That's the biggest joy of salvation, knowing on this side of eternity that I have to look forward to eternity. And here he doesn't have it. He's saying, return that to me, because what I have right here I don't want. What I have right here I can't deal with. What I have right here I can't live with anymore. I've got to have something different. And then there's a transition in verse 13. A one-word transition. Are you ready for it? Then. Then is the transition in verse 13. Up until the beginning of verse 13, the first 12 verses, what we have is a man who's pouring out his emotional state where he can't forgive himself, and he's constantly looking at what foolish decision he made. But much like every other psalm, most of David's psalms, most of them start out on a pretty low note. Because of wherever he is, he's thinking, man, the country's in turmoil. These enemies are pressing in on me. My son's acting like a nut. They usually crescendo up into a high note as he stops thinking about the things that are here and begins to think about the things that are eternal. And this is where it happens in this particular psalm. In verse number 13, then once all of these things have happened with me, and they already have, then will I teach transgressors your way, and sinners shall be converted unto thee. Notice those phrases there. Then I can talk to other people who are living the same way I do and say, you didn't have to live that way. You didn't have to make those decisions. I can show you a better way. I can show you God's way. I can show you how to get out of that mire and get up and walk and follow after God. That's when that happens. Then I can do that. When is that? After I've gotten myself out of there by your help, obviously. When I've stopped doing those things, then I can tell somebody else. Imagine if you could, if Caleb and I are, we enjoy using illegal drugs together. That's something we don't we just enjoy that. And I tell him while we're using those drugs, boy, you ought to stop doing that. How much clout does that have? Zero. But what if I have changed my life and gotten out of those things, and I say, Caleb, let me tell you what you ought to be doing. Follow me the way I'm going, and that will lead you out of this place. Would he do that then? He would be more apt to do that, wouldn't he? Here David's saying, let me get out of the pig pen in which I sit so that I can pull others out of there with me. Sound familiar? Does it sound anything like the idea of evangelism that we studied about in Bible class? Why do we do that? We ended with because we acknowledge the terror of the Lord. Obviously, yeah. Why? Because we were there. David would say, let me get out of this place, and at that point when I'm out, I'm going to reach back and grab somebody out too. I'm going to look for the transgressor. I'm going to look for that sinner. Here's where we notice him as he closes his eyes. Deliver me from the blood guiltiness, O God. I don't know, even on a rough estimate, I don't know how many men lost their lives to David in battle. I don't know. I can tell you this, it's a bunch of them. Here's what I do know. There's one guy that haunts him. This one guy here in verse 14 is the one that he thinks about. This is the one that he realizes is not in a warfare, that is not to save the people of Israel or to protect the nation of Israel, but this is the one that he did right out of cold blood to save his own hide. And he mentions that particular death, different from all of those battlefield deaths, as being blood guiltiness. Matter of fact, David looked at it and said, I'm guilty. There's no way to sugarcoat this. Uriah the Hittite is not alive because of me. Deliver me from that guilt. Notice what he says about God. The sacrifice, verse 16, you don't desire sacrifice. God doesn't say, well, I'll be satisfied with mankind if he can offer X, Y, and Z as a sacrifice. Eric, if you'll just give a bull and a sheep and a goat, then God will overlook everything. That's not what God, even in the Old Testament, that was not what God's intent was for the sacrifice of the animals. That was never his intent. He said, you don't expect sacrifice, else I'd give that. He's the king of Israel. He's got all kinds of sacrifices he could give. He could give all manner of, just gallons and gallons and gallons of blood. But if he walks right out of the sacrifice and he does the exact same thing, what's changed? His quest is not, God's quest is not blood. God's quest is the changing of man's hearts. Here he said, it's not sacrifice, else I would give that. What you require is a broken and contrite heart. What you require is me seeing what's wrong and stopping. What does God want you to do? He wants you to stop acting like a knucklehead and start following Him. What an easy statement. What a hard thing to do. And here's why. I don't know if you're like me. If I'm real honest about it, I like that path. How about you? That path leads to destruction, doesn't it? All right. David said, if it were just sacrifices, I got sacrifices. If it were just animals, got that. It's not that. It's the changing of a heart from selfishness to selflessness. You have a hard time forgiving yourself? Change your heart. It's easier said than done. Yes it is. But that's the process. You know, David only has the opportunity in Psalm 51 to speak to God in the fashion that he does because he's his child. He only has that option. Because underneath that Old Testament law, he is an Israelite. He is one of those chosen. He is brought into that covenant on the 8th day of his life. He is a child of God. He has the right to stand before God and speak that way. Interestingly, today, we only have the right to speak to God because we're his children. It might be the case you've not become his child, but you ought to. Then you would have the opportunity to speak to him. Then you would have the opportunity to lay your life out flat before him and say, these are the things that are bothering me. These are the things that are hurting me. These are the things that are haunting me. Can you take them away? But he only does that for his children. He only does that for his children. Well, then, preacher, I need to become a child of his. That's a great answer. I can show you where to find that. When you and I look through the pages of inspiration, what we find is God's plan of salvation that is so simple. Any man or woman on this earth can do it if they have that desire. But in order to do that, you got to kind of know what he wants you to do, right? That's Romans 10:17. You have to understand what he says and then do those things. If I understand what he says and I'm willing to do those things, that's John chapter 8, verse 24. Unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins. Yeah, well, I believe you are. Well, great. Would you be willing to repent of your sin? I'm not sure, preacher. I'm not really sure what that means. That means turning from this path to that path. It means stop doing this and start doing that. Understanding that this path is wrong and walking down that path that leads toward God. Would you be willing to do that? Luke chapter 13, verse 3 and 5, Jesus would command that. Would you be willing to confess that Jesus is the Christ? The confession of Jesus is being the Christ is the bedrock of Christianity, salvation, and the church. If you don't believe Jesus is the Christ, but that man can get to God any other way than through Jesus, or even including Jesus, you've missed the boat. There is no other way. Jesus would say in John chapter 14 and verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He qualifies that at the end by saying, no man cometh unto the Father but by me. Now, is it getting more itter than that? That's pretty plain, even for a guy from Alabama. If you want to go to God, you're going to have to go through Jesus Christ. You're going to confess him as the Messiah. If I'm going to do that, would you be willing to be baptized? Romans chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Would you be willing to be buried in death and raised to walk in the newness of life? Would you be willing to be added to the family of God? It happens through that plan of salvation. It doesn't happen by cutting off any of the parts of those five, but it happens by completing all five of those things. Then you have the right to speak to God. Then he gives you the right where he will turn his attention as you speak to you. Now think about that for just a second. where the God of heaven and earth, the creator of everything that is, the sustainer, the eternal one, turns all of his attention to what you're saying and listens to you. That's a privilege of his children. You can have that privilege, but you're going to have to obey how to be adopted into his family. That's not the end. That's really just the beginning. There's one more thing God would require of his servant, and that is to remain faithful. It is necessary that not only do I put on Christ in baptism, but I got to stay inside that house. You've got to stay inside that house. When you look back at Exodus chapter number 11, the last plague that happens to Egypt, what is it? Death of the firstborn, right? But everybody who's inside that house who has the blood across the doorpost and the lintel, everybody there will be saved. Right? Y'all know what I'm talking about? Shake or not. All right. So, if I am inside that house in Exodus chapter 11, I am alive or dead? Alive. If I'm 1 foot different and I'm outside, what am I? Life's found inside the house. Child, you better stay inside that house. You better live that faithful life. You better remain faithful to God, the supplier of life. It's just as easy as that house with the blood on the doorpost and the lintels. I'm either in or out. I'm either faithful or unfaithful. Now, child, which one is it? As you sit there looking at me, you know the answer to that. 100%, don't you? If you've never put on Christ in baptism, you need to. If sitting there your answer is I'm unfaithful, you need to come back home. Because God forgives. Just as he forgave David. Just as eventually David's going to forgive himself. God always forgives. But in order to get that forgiveness, you're going to have to be inside that house. Are you subject to that invitation? Why not come now? While we stand and sing.
You may have your